Thanks for coming today. We're here to announce the authorship of a constitutional amendment to clarify the language in the single subject clause. Because last session, we had what many of our DFL compadres, colleagues like to term as omnibus prime. There's omnibus prime. That is an actual copy of last year's omnibus bill that was released to the members at 7:06 on the Sunday evening, and we voted at 11:22 on that bill. There is no way that any of us could read that. Representative Munson will speak to his attempts at reading that on the floor between the time it was released and the time that it was that we were scheduled to vote on that bill. So there's a couple provisions that we have added to the single subject clause in our proposed legislation here, our proposed constitutional amendment. One of those is that should the court find any funding bills in violation of the single subject clause, instead of closing down the government, which has been the in Blanc versus Suburban Hennepin Regional Park District back in 1989. That's what one of the reasons they did not strike that bill down then was they would have closed down a portion of the government because the legislature had already adjourned. We were in the next fiscal year. So one of our provisions to allow the court more latitude in this is a 95% funding from the previous biennium would go into place if the courts found anything unconstitutional under the single subject clause, which would then give the legislature time to act and divvy up or adjust the bill into a manner that's suitable to the courts without shutting the government down. Another provision that we put in that is in this amendment is the no bill. We may not add to a title of a bill. If there's something needs to be taken out or a piece is amended out of a bill after introduction, the title can be more restrictive, but it will not be allowed to grow, which when you look at this one from last year, this, and this, and this, and this are the title of the bill, and that's all a list of statute numbers. So yes, it gets very cumbersome, and the courts have ruled basically that, or the way the legislature is reading this, Mattson versus Kedrowski in 1985 was one of the first ones where the court opened it up and said, as long as it's in the title, it can be in the bill. So there has been one other ruling since then, Associated Builders versus Contractors and Contractors versus Ventura in 2000, that was kind of the final nail in the coffin for allowing pretty much anything we want to do into one bill. And there's a couple of things that I wanted to pass along, a little more information. I went back and looked at the constitutional debates from 1858, because this provision has been in our state constitution since we've been a state. And this is the entirety of the debate on this. And the purpose, as stated, is my objective in moving this amendment is to guard against a practice which has been to a greater or lesser extent prevalent in this territory as well as in other states, or grouping together several different subjects in one bill and passing them through the means known as log rolling. The amendment was agreed to. There was no opposition to this. Everybody understood that putting multiple pieces of legislation together is, you're buying votes by doing this. You're not doing it with cash in your back pocket. You're buying it with pork for your district. We want this project here, we want that project there. An example of still buying these votes, or a perfect example of log rolling, is 2 years ago in the omnibus bill. I had a member tell me that they had to vote for the bill because they're the $1 billion bonding bill, because there was a $1 million project for his district in there. Well, I'm sorry, my vote is not for sale for $1 million for a bill to put the people of my district or the people of the state on the hook on the credit card for $1 billion for $1 million. I have a little problem with understanding that logic in there. So I also wanted to go and mention some of the pieces on just how bad, how backwards we have gone. In The 1973-1974 biennium, the legislature passed and the governor actually signed into law 1,366 different pieces of legislation. And since that time, in these 3 Supreme Court rulings, we have been steadily going backwards to the point where the last biennium we set a new record low of 189 bills. So we ran the entire government, which has multiplied by at least 5 or 6 times, in 7, 8 times since 1974, in its size, scope, breadth, money, everything, influence in our lives or intrusion into our lives, and to the point where now we're doing all of this with 189 bills for 2 years. That is not doing the voters a service, and it's not doing the government itself. It's not doing, we aren't doing service to ourselves or our constituents by having everything piled into just a handful of bills. When voters go to the voting booth, they want to know what their legislator stands for, how they vote on a specific issue, what they really stand for, and they cannot do that when you have things like Omnibus Prime in front of you, because there are provisions in there I would gladly and happily vote for, and there are provisions in there that I am vehemently opposed to. Now, when I go to the polls, or go to my voters and say I voted against this, I voted against a lot of things that they support and that I support. And that's automatic fodder for my opposition. And then I can also say, well, I saved you on this, 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 and this. I did these positive things by doing a negative thing. The voters have no idea what we're doing, what we're talking about, or what we stand for. And that's one of the reasons that most of the members behind me are part of the new Republican Caucus, is because we believe in transparency and we believe in letting the chips fall where they may. We want our voters to know, our constituents to know exactly what we're doing and why we're doing it. And on that, I will turn it over to one of the Mr. Representative Munson.
Yeah, I also wanted to express gratitude to Representative Freiberg, who's also signed on to this legislation, and he would like to be here today, but he's chairing a committee and could not step away. But this issue has bipartisan support. And this is about accountability and transparency in government. And as Representative Bahr mentioned earlier, my wife joined me on the floor of the House the last day of session to actually read this bill. And I went through every page of the bill, and it's not just the legislation that's being rolled together into this enormous monstrosity that we're voting on. It's also single items that delete one word in a larger statute, and so you have to cross-reference almost on every page other statutes that it's impacting, and for legislators to just understand what they're voting on in the bill is almost impossible, but then moreover to understand the impacts of just removing one word from statute. And there's legislation in this omnibus bill that came to us 4 or 5 hours before we had to vote on it that never saw the light of committee. And the committee process is really important too, to make sure that we improve legislation as it goes through that process. So we want transparency in government. Everybody in Minnesota wants transparency in government and holding our legislators accountable, and that's why this constitutional amendment is so very important. We hope we can get a hearing on this in both the House and Senate, and by the way, it does not need the governor's approval. Just passing the House and Senate is enough to the process that it will be put on the ballot in the 2020 election. Representative Drazkowski, your words?
Thank you. Thanks, Representative Bahr, for bringing this bill. We had discussion last year in depth about this big honkin', I like to call it a garbage bill because there's a lot of garbage in it, and it's really construed that way. But we had discussion with then the House minority at the time, Representative Freiberg and others that were committed to, because they were very critical of this process that produces these huge omnibus prime bills. And by the way, this wasn't the first time this has happened. It happened when Democrats were in control in 2013 and 14. A bill it looks the same as this on a podium here. Certainly the contents were different, but it's the same construct. Hundreds and hundreds of bills put together in one big bill is what they did then. It's what the Republican-led House did last year, and it's what has happened a number of times over the past few decades. We have to stop this. Representative Bahr's bill is the only way that we can do that, and in order to avoid the things that Representative Munson and Bahr outlined earlier, Representative Bahr is bringing this bill forward. And I will just end with this. Transparency is about restoring public trust in the legislature, in our government, and in Minnesota, people need to know what is going on here. And some do look at the legislative process as kind of a card game. And if that metaphor is true, citizens must be able to watch the hands of their leaders while they're moving the cards. And that's what we have today. We would like to be able to vote on one provision, one bill, piece of the bill at a time. This bill, and then this bill next, and then this bill next, and bring those then to the governor for his signature or veto at that point. So that's what we would like to do. Thank you, Representative Bahr, for bringing this bill.
I'm State Representative Tim Miller from District 17A, and I really want to thank Representative Bahr for taking a leadership position on this, and I look forward to discussing this as we move forward. The people of Minnesota have been very clear. The voters of Minnesota have been very clear. They want to have a better government. They want to have a more transparent government. They want a government that serves them directly. They want us representatives to serve the people of our district. This is going to allow us to do that. Now the challenge is this goes in direct opposition to a government as usual, and there's a lot of people that are government as usual around here. We're going to need everyone that hears about this bill to let their representatives, let their senators, let the governor know that this is important. We need to get this passed through the House and the Senate, and then it comes to all of you, the voters of Minnesota, to decide if you want this. But we can't get that far without the support of other representatives of the legislature. So please contact yours, let them know this is important to you, and hopefully we can move this forward this year. Thank you.
I also want to thank Representative Bahr for bringing this legislation forward. Trust, transparency, and accountability are what Minnesotans expect. And while I am not a member of the new House Republican Caucus, I am here in support of this, as was already mentioned, members of the Democrat caucus as well. This is a strong bipartisan piece of legislation. It is one that Minnesotans support, and it is the voices that we are listening to and responding to in order to return state government to constitutional principles. Thank you.
So in closing, I guess there's one last thing I'd like to mention, that this would also help the committee process. That was brought up, the committee piece to this. Too many times we hear something in committee and roll it into the omnibus bill or roll it into another bill. This bill, should it pass, or this amendment, should it pass, would preclude that. There would be no more rolling something in. It's as introduced or less than introduced. And then we're actually going to start voting on things in committee. I had a committee last year, I had a whopping 3 votes in the committee for an entire year, and 2 of those were on the omnibus bill. That is not a good, clean committee process. That's not transparency in government. So as Representative Miller mentioned, please contact if you find this a positive move for transparency, for your accountability, and to hold our feet to the fire at the ballot box, then please contact your representative and have them co-author on this bill, and let's move this forward. Thank you for your time. That's it.